In 1324, a man left the city of Niani with 60,000 people, 80 camels, and enough gold to destabilize the economies of 3 continents. His name was Mansa Musa. He was the emperor of Mali, and by every economic measure that historians and economists have applied to the question, he was the wealthiest human being who has ever lived. Not one of the wealthiest. The wealthiest. This is documented in Arabic, in Egyptian court records, in European maps and chronicles, multiple independent sources, in multiple languages, across multiple decades, all recording the same man and the same empire. You were never taught this. Most people who went through 12 years of formal education in the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, or Australia have never heard the name Mansa Musa. And if they have, it was a footnote, a curiosity, not the central figure in the history of wealth and civilization that the evidence says he was. That absence is not an accident. It is the result of specific decisions made by specific people in specific institutions over the course of roughly 4 centuries. This video is about Mansa Musa, but it is also about those decisions, because you cannot understand the man without understanding why he was erased. So let's start there. Let's start with why you don't know this name. The history you were taught in school was not a neutral selection of the most important events and people in human history. It was a curated story, and the curation had a logic. That logic was built, in large part, during the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries, when European colonial powers were engaged in the project of justifying their domination of Africa, Asia, and the Americas. The argument that justified colonialism required a specific version of history. It required a version in which non-European civilizations were primitive, disorganized, and incapable of the kind of sophisticated governance, intellectual achievement, and past material wealth that European civilization had produced. That version of history was not just propaganda. It was taught in universities, published in academic journals, written into school curricula, and repeated until it became, for most people, simply the way things were. Mansa Musa was a problem for that version of history. An emperor who controlled more wealth than any European monarch of his era, who funded universities and built libraries while European cities were struggling with the Black Death, who was recognized by contemporary Arab, Egyptian, and European sources as one of the most powerful rulers in the world. That man did not fit the story that colonialism needed to tell about Africa. So, he was minimized, footnoted, occasionally mentioned in academic texts, but rarely included in the curricula that shaped what most people know. The documentation was always there. The decision was to leave it out. Now let's talk about what that documentation actually says. Mansa Musa came to power in 1312 CE as the 10th Mansa. The title means emperor, or king of kings, of the Mali Empire. The empire he inherited already controlled the most significant gold-producing regions in the known world. The trans-Saharan trade routes that connected West Africa to North Africa, the Mediterranean, and eventually Europe passed through Mali's territory. And gold and salt, the 2 most economically critical commodities of the medieval world, were subject to Mali's control. To understand what that meant economically, you need to understand something about the medieval world that most Western curricula never teach. The gold that fueled the economies of medieval Europe largely came from West Africa. The gold coins that circulated in European markets, the gold that funded the Italian banking houses, the gold behind the Islamic financial networks that stretched from Spain to Southeast Asia. A significant portion of all of it passed through the Mali Empire. The historian Nehemiah Levtzion, writing in 1973, estimated that Mali controlled territory of roughly 2 million square kilometers. That is larger than the entirety of Western Europe. Mansa Musa inherited that empire. Then he spent the next 2 decades expanding it. If you found that surprising, that an African empire in the 14th century was larger than all of Western Europe combined, I want to sit with that for a moment, because that surprise is itself evidence of the erasure. Not a failure of your curiosity, a failure of what you were given access to. By 1324, the Mali Empire included what is today Senegal, the Gambia, Guinea-Bissau, Guinea, Sierra Leone, large portions of Mauritania and Mali, and significant parts of Niger and Burkina Faso. It controlled the Niger River, the most important inland waterway in West Africa. It controlled Timbuktu, Djenné, and Gao, 3 of the most significant cities in the medieval world by any measure of commerce, scholarship, or population. And at the center of all of it sat Mansa Musa, administering an empire of extraordinary complexity, taxing trade routes across millions of square kilometers, and accumulating wealth at a scale that the modern world has no real equivalent for. In 1324, he decided to make the Hajj, the pilgrimage to Mecca that is one of the 5 pillars of Islam. What happened on that journey is where the documentation gets extraordinary. The Egyptian scholar Al-Umari was based in Cairo in the years following Musa's pilgrimage. He interviewed people who had been present during the emperor's arrival, people who had witnessed what happened, and he compiled their accounts into a historical record that survives to this day. What Al-Umari documented is not legend. It is contemporary reportage. Mansa Musa arrived in Cairo with a caravan of approximately 60,000 people, and among them were 12,000 personal servants, each of whom carried a staff of solid gold. He traveled with 80 camels, and each camel carried between 300 and 500 pounds of gold dust. He brought so much gold with him that he gave it away freely to officials, to merchants, to the poor he encountered along his route. He gave gold to mosques. He gave gold to strangers. He spent and donated so lavishly that the gold markets of Cairo, already one of the most important financial centers in the world, collapsed. Gold flooded the market, the price fell, and it did not recover for 12 years. Think about what that means. One man on a religious journey, carrying his personal wealth, distributed enough gold in a single trip that he caused a decade-long economic depression across the most sophisticated financial markets in the known world. Al-Umari records Cairene merchants and traders describing the damage in terms of genuine crisis. Businesses that had operated for generations suddenly found their margins destroyed, their contracts worthless, their savings devalued. Mansa Musa later sent agents back to Cairo to attempt to buy back some of the gold at above-market rates to help stabilize the economy his pilgrimage had inadvertently destabilized. He was, in other words, wealthy enough to crash an economy and then wealthy enough to attempt to repair it. The inflation-adjusted estimates of Mansa Musa's wealth have varied over the years. The most widely cited figures range from $400 billion to amounts that economists describe as essentially incalculable. Because the Mali Empire's control of gold and salt trade was so foundational to the medieval global economy that applying modern financial frameworks to it is somewhat like trying to put a dollar value on controlling the internet. The comparison breaks down before it resolves. What is not in dispute? He was the wealthiest person in documented human history. That is the consensus of the historians, economists, and financial scholars who have studied the question. Now let's talk about what he did with that wealth. Because this is the part of the story that the erasure damaged most. Not just the gold, but what was built with it. What Mansa Musa constructed during his reign was not a treasury, it was a civilization. Timbuktu, by the time of Musa's reign, was already a significant city. Under his patronage, it became something more. He commissioned the construction of the Jingareba Mosque in 1327, designed by the Andalusian architect Abu Ishaq al-Sahili, whom Musa had brought back from his pilgrimage. The mosque still stands. It is still used today. It is one of the oldest continuously operating religious structures in the world. But the building that had the most lasting impact was not a mosque. It was a university. The University of Sankore in Timbuktu had been developing as a center of Islamic scholarship for roughly 2 centuries before Musa's reign. Under his patronage, it became something that medieval Europe had no equivalent for. At its peak, and scholars like John Hunwick, who spent decades studying the Timbuktu manuscript tradition, have documented this carefully. The university had approximately 25,000 enrolled students. The city of Timbuktu at that time had a total population of roughly 100,000 people. 1 in 4 residents was a student or scholar. The library collections attached to the university and the broader scholarly community of Timbuktu contained, by the estimates of the Timbuktu Manuscript Project at the University of Cape Town, between 400,000 and 700,000 manuscripts. Texts on mathematics, astronomy, medicine, law, history, and theology. Written in Arabic, in Songhai, in Bambara, in Hausa. Copied, annotated, debated, and preserved. Oxford University was founded in 1096. Sankore had been educating scholars for a century before Oxford enrolled its first student. Cambridge was founded in 1209. By that point, Sankore had already produced generations of scholars whose work was cited across the Islamic world, from Spain to Persia. The comparison is not meant to diminish Oxford or Cambridge. It is meant to make precise what the erasure cost. When Western educational systems taught their students that universities were a European invention, they were not making an error of emphasis. They were making a factual claim that the evidence directly contradicts. The documentation for Sankore's scale and sophistication was always available. It was in Arabic. That was, apparently, sufficient reason to leave it out. What strikes me about this, and I want to be precise about what I mean, is not that the history was unfamiliar. Unfamiliar histories become familiar when they are taught. What strikes me is that the decision to not teach it required active or ongoing work. Historians wrote about Mansa Musa. Travelers documented the Mali Empire. The manuscripts were always there. Each generation of curriculum designers, textbook editors, and educational policymakers had to look at that evidence and choose, again, to leave it out. The erasure was not passive. It was maintained. Let's talk about what happened after Musa's reign, because the end of the Mali Empire is itself a document of what was lost and how. Mansa Musa died around 1337 CE, approximately 25 years after coming to power. The empire he left behind was the largest and wealthiest in the Western Sudan, and among the most significant in the world. But empires are not immortal, and the successors who followed Musa did not govern with his skill. Internal succession disputes weakened central authority. The Songhai Empire, or based in Gao, expanded and began absorbing Mali's eastern territories. By the late 15th century, the Mali Empire had contracted significantly from its peak. In 1591, a Moroccan army crossed the Sahara and sacked Timbuktu. The city that had been a center of global scholarship for 4 centuries was looted. Scholars were arrested, exiled, or killed. Ahmad Baba al-Timbukti, one of the most prominent scholars of the era, was taken to Marrakech in chains. He later wrote about the destruction of his personal library. He estimated that he had lost approximately 1,600 books. His personal collection. Not the university's. His. The manuscripts that survived, and many did survive, hidden in private homes, buried in desert sand, preserved by families who understood what they held, scattered across the region. The recovery and documentation of those manuscripts became one of the major scholarly projects of the 20th and early 21st centuries. The Timbuktu Manuscript Project and parallel efforts by Malian scholars have worked for decades to collect, digitize, and translate texts that were written before most European universities existed. And then, in 2012, a jihadist group called Ansar Dine took control of Timbuktu. Before they were driven out by French military intervention in 2013. They destroyed cultural sites across the city. But Malian scholars had anticipated the attack. They had spent months quietly moving manuscripts, hundreds of thousands of documents, out of the city in secret, hiding them in private homes and transporting them south. Most of the collection survived. The manuscripts are still being catalogued. The scholarship they contain is still being translated and studied. The world is still, in 2024, recovering information about a civilization that was producing it 700 years ago. That is what was buried. Not a curiosity, not a footnote. A civilization whose intellectual output took centuries to even begin to recover. Here is what Mansa Musa's legacy looks like in the world today. The geographic territory that was the Mali Empire corresponds roughly to the modern nations of Mali, Senegal, Guinea, Guinea-Bissau, and parts of surrounding countries. Those nations are, by most economic metrics, among the poorest in the world. The wealth that was extracted from those territories, first through the trans-Saharan trade, then through the Atlantic slave trade, then through European colonial extraction, did not remain there, as it moved north and west. The gold that the Mali Empire produced, the labor that West African people performed, the resources that West African land contained, they funded the accumulation of capital elsewhere. The historian Walter Rodney, in his 1972 work, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, documented the mechanisms by which this transfer of wealth operated. The argument is not that Africa was passive or without agency in this history. It is that the specific economic structures put in place during the colonial era were designed to extract value from Africa and deposit it elsewhere, and that those structures left behind poverty rather than development. The most direct line from Mansa, Musa's empire to the present, is not the poverty, though. It is the manuscripts, the knowledge, the evidence that sits in archives and private collections across Mali, Mauritania, and the diaspora, still being recovered, still being translated, still rewriting what we thought we knew about the history of human achievement. The story of Mansa Musa is not over. It is, in many ways, just beginning to be told. When you finish this video, you will know something that 12 years of formal education in most Western countries did not give you. Not because the information was unavailable, not because the historians hadn't done the work, but because the institutions that decided what you would learn made a choice, and that choice had consequences that are still visible in what you know and what you don't. The question worth sitting with is this: if this was buried, what else was? That is not a rhetorical question. It has specific answers, and this channel exists to document them, one buried empire at a time. If this video rewrote something you thought you knew, drop it in the comments. Tell me what surprised you first. I want to know, because the next video I make might be the story you mention. The next video on this channel is about a woman who fought the Portuguese Empire for 40 years and never surrendered her kingdom. Her name was Nzinga. She was a queen, a general, and a diplomat, and she won. You were never taught her name either. That changes next.